This is a joyous moment for the Grunt family and for the Wiener family and for this entire congregation. After Blake carried the tour around, I saw him sitting there and I saw him massaging his forearm. He's still doing it. And I was thinking the last time God had written something that heavy, even Moses couldn't hold the tablets, you know? Before my sermon, I just want to give a recollection of something that I remembered on Thursday night. It brought back something that took place 31 years ago for me, and it was the following. I was watching the second half of the Steelers-Browns game. Anybody watch it? Yeah, okay. So, as you know, it was snowing really hard in Cleveland. In Municipal Stadium, the field was covered with white snow. Kind of a beautiful sight when you're on the other side of the television screen. So, in the year 1993, that was my last year working in a congregation in Ohio. And on a Monday morning, a friend called me up and said, "David, would you like to go to the Monday night football game? The Browns are playing the Dolphins." I said, "I'd love to." So it was a cold day, and as the day was coming to an end, it was beginning to sleet and snow and rain, and it was windy. And then we entered into Municipal Stadium, and those of you who know the stadiums in this country know that Municipal Stadium was built for its aesthetics, but without any awareness as to where it was planted in space. So it was like a horseshoe, and it was open on one end to Lake Erie. So on a night like this, what was happening is the winds were blowing into the stadium and swirling around. I grew up north in New England. I lived in Ohio. I knew cold weather. I was prepared for this moment, but I wasn't. It was so awful and so cold, and I felt like begging my friends, "Let's get out of here." You know, like, we'll catch it on the radio on the way back home. So we stayed till the end, and I made the following promise to myself. I said I would never go to an NFL game at night in the winter again. Fast forward 1 year. I'm the rabbi at B'nai Torah congregation in Boca Raton. I get a call from a good friend. He says, this is the second week in November, same week. He said, "David, would you want to go to a Monday night football game? The Dolphins are playing the Browns at Dolphin Stadium." Be careful what you promise yourself. That's all I can tell you. It was the most beautiful evening, and I thought, this is why I'm at B'nai Torah. Well, one of the most overused expressions that we're hearing in our days is found in the phrase, "Things are complicated." It's gotten to the point where I feel a bit annoyed by people saying this, because I believe that things are always complicated. But that doesn't free us of thinking clearly or our obligations. Complicated times, however, like complicated relationships, can make us very uneasy. But even in complicated times, we need to find some answers. We need some responses. Perhaps we also need places that will help us find some comfort, and maybe even find something that is simpler, something that's easier. This past week, I was on a conference call with a number of other rabbinic fellows from the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. The Institute set up this call to create a type of support group for rabbis who are trying to be rabbis, trying to give answers during complicated times. The discussion was both about how the rabbis themselves were feeling, but also how were they choosing to express themselves during these days when politics are so divided and difficult. Specifically, it was about perceptions of the war in Israel, the hostage crisis, politics in Israel, and also being in post-election America. How were they feeling? What were they saying? What were they saying to their congregants? It's too bad you weren't on the conversation, but I'll tell you it was complicated. But there's one thing that I sensed that separated the rabbis who were doing well from those who either weren't able to find a place for themselves or a place to focus their words and their actions. It had to do with all of the challenges that we're faced with, but also had to do a little bit with simplifying their approach and their direction. For me, amongst this group of rabbis, it was most notable with what my friend Rabbi Michael Siegel from Anshe Emeth congregation in Chicago said. He said he was focusing all of his work now on the challenges in the local community, the Jewish community and its relationship with other communities, the politics and social conditions of Chicago. And he would continue his work with the struggles of his city and the betterment of his community. It gave him something to focus on, something I knew and he knew had implications not just for Chicago, but the larger world. There's lots of troubles in this world. And sometimes we realize as individuals we see it, but there's not much that we can do. We're limited in what any one of us can do as individuals. But we can bring change in smaller places. And it always begins with changes that we can bring with those closest to us. Some may have the capacity to change or influence the organization they belong to, perhaps even the tone of the language at their HOA. And some are committed to seeing that the synagogue remains strong and meaningful and vibrant. Most of us don't have much of a range of influence, and we know that, and that's part of the frustration. But as I read this week's Parsha, I thought of something where every single one of us can have great impact. So let me begin with a story outside the Parsha. Do you know the name Stephen Carter? You know? Dr. Stephen Carter is a professor at Yale University's law school. He's considered to be a great legal scholar. Carter is a historian and he's an author. And he tells the following. In 1966, as an 11-year-old black boy, he moved with his parents and family to a white neighborhood in Washington, D.C. He sat with his two brothers and two sisters the day that they moved into their new home. And he waited to see how they would be greeted by their white neighbors. And what he saw is they weren't greeted. Passerbys turned to look at them, but no one gave them a smile or a wave or a glance of recognition. And so for Stephen Carter, all the fearful stories he had heard about how whites treated blacks seemed to be coming true so quickly. Years later, writing about those first days in his new home, he said, "I knew that we weren't welcome there. I knew we would not be liked. I knew we would not have friends there. And I knew we shouldn't have moved there." And as he was thinking those thoughts, a white woman came home from work. She passed by on the other side of the street. She turned to these 5 children who were sitting on the stoop. And with a broad smile and a wave, she said, "Welcome." She then disappeared into her home, and she emerged minutes later with a tray that had drinks and cream cheese and jelly sandwiches, which she brought over to the children, and she made them feel at home. That moment, the young man later wrote, changed his life. It gave him a sense of hope and a sense of belonging where he never had that sense before. And it made him realize at a time when race relations in the United States were fraught, that a black family could feel at home in a white neighborhood, and that there could be relationships which were colorblind. Over the years, he learned to admire much about that woman who lived across the street. But it was her first spontaneous act of greeting that became for him a definitive memory. It broke a wall of separation, and it turned the strangers into friends. So as I mentioned, he eventually became a law professor at Yale, and he wrote about what he learned that day in a book. The name of the book is Civility, and the name of the woman was Sarah Kestenbaum. Sarah died all too young. He added that it was, in his book, he wrote, it was no coincidence that she was a religious Jew, because, he wrote, in the Jewish tradition, such civility has a name. It's called chesed, doing acts of loving kindness, which is a term derived from the understanding that every human being is made in the image of God. Every human being deserves kindness, he said. Civility, he added, itself may be seen as a part of chesed. It indeed requires kindness towards our fellow citizens, including the ones with whom we disagree, with those people who are strangers, even when it feels so difficult. To this day, he added, I can close my eyes and I can feel on my tongue the smooth, slick sweetness of cream cheese and jelly sandwiches that I gobbled on that summer afternoon. And I discovered how a single act of genuine and unassuming civility can change a life forever. In the Torah reading today, there's a story about Eliezer, Abraham's servant, who was sent to find a wife for his son Isaac. Abraham didn't tell him to look for any specific traits of character. He simply told him to find someone from his own extended family. But Eliezer formulated a test. He said the following, and it's a quote, Lord, God of my master Abraham, make me successful and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I'm standing beside the spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, please let down your jar that I could have a drink, she will say, drink, and I'll water your camel too. Let her be the one that you've chosen for your servant Isaac. By this fact, that she will give me to drink, and she will say, I'll water your camel too. She will have shown kindness, chesed. His use of the word chesed here isn't an accident. It's the very characteristic he's looking for in the future wife of the first Jewish child, Isaac. And he found it in this woman, in Rebecca. It's this theme also of a very important transitional book in our tradition, the book of Ruth. Because what we learn is it is Ruth's kindness to Naomi and Boaz's kindness to Ruth that creates the background for King David one day. Indeed, our sages said the three characteristics most important to a Jewish character are the following: modesty, compassion, and kindness. So chesed, we learn, is central to our value system. The sages based it on the acts of God himself. In the Talmud, Rav Simlai says, the Torah begins with an act of kindness and ends with an act of kindness. It begins with God clothing the naked, and it ends with God bearing Moses, considered to be one of the greatest acts of kindness. Chesed, kindness. It's lived out here at B'nai Torah in the form of an organization that we have called TLC. Not tender, loving, caring, but tzedakah, limud, and chesed. That's a program rooted in our desire to show kindness to those in underserved populations. Directed by a woman who's perhaps one of the most well-known people in our entire community, not just here. We have hundreds of volunteers who provide shelter for the homeless, food for the hungry, assistance to the poor, eyes to the blind. They visit the sick, and they visit the elderly. During many centuries of exile for the Jewish people, Jewish communities built themselves around the needs of people who are less fortunate. They were the central institutions of our Jewish communities, chevras, friendly societies. But acts of chesed aren't just connected to institutions. Perhaps more importantly, they are in the ability of every single person to show kindness to another. I'm a witness to it all the time. In my work, I've seen the most unbearable tragedies which seemed unsurmountable, but somehow people survive. And there's one quality that enables it. It's the love of families that they have for each other. It's the love that neighbors show each other. It's the love that friends bring. It's the love of a community, and even the love from strangers. That love is measured in what we call gemilut chasadim. So yeah, these are difficult, challenging times. And we who have lived a while, and we who know what history can bring, know that there have been many other times like this in history. But I will tell you how we deal with it. We deal with it by staying close to each other, and by extending that love through kindness to one another. Chesed, the rabbis taught us, in some respects is higher than even tzedakah. Why? Tzedakah is done with money. Chesed is done with both money and with one's actions and words. Tzedakah is done for the poor. Chesed is done for both the poor and the rich. Tzedakah is given to the living, while chesed is shown to the living and the dead. Chesed in its many forms became synonymous with Jewish life, and it's a pillar on which we stand. Jews perform kindness to one another because we saw this as the way of God, one of the essential elements of God's being. So we've had moments where our entire people have suffered. We know it from events in the recent past, for sure. But we have a paradigm that goes back 2,000 years, and I want to remind you of that. When the temple was destroyed by the Romans and thousands of people were murdered, and our ancestors were decimated and living in despair, and our story became a story of return through creating communities. See, our community found its ultimate comfort in the ability to have atonement from that temple. And it was no longer there. But one day, Rabbi Yochanan was walking out of Jerusalem. Rabbi Yoshua followed him, and seeing the temple was in ruins, that place where the people could find comfort and return. He asked, what will we do in the face of destruction? The place is in ruins. The place where our people could come together with each other in God. Unified, Rabbi Yochanan said to him one thing. He said, my son, don't grieve anymore. We have another way of doing this. It's no less effective. It's found in loving kindness. Through chesed, Jews humanized their fate. Through chesed, they believed God humanizes the world. So now, where's Jude? Jude? You go to the Abraham Joshua Heschel School, right? Yeah. So this is what Abraham Joshua Heschel once said. And he was a brilliant man. He was a leader of the Jewish people. His words live on with us. You probably learned them in school, right? Yeah. So this is what he said. He said, when I was a young man, I admired people for their cleverness. When I was a young man, I admired people who knew a lot. He said, but now that I'm old, what I admire most are people who are kind. There's deep wisdom in those words. It's what led Eliezer to choose Rivka, to become Isaac's wife, and thus the first Jewish bride. We think that kindness can redeem the world. As we heard in the case of Stephen Carter, it changes lives. I'm not being Pollyannish. I see the pain in life as you do. I see the pain in the world as you do. I see the flaws inside of myself and in others. I understand that there's darkness. I know it's complicated. But when we're willing to be more kind, and this is the challenge to each and every one of us, and when we're willing to receive kindness from others, we bring a little bit of light, and that's where the change begins. And so during these days, which seem overwhelming, confusing, and challenging, complicated, there are things that each one of us know that we can do. Places we can get involved, but perhaps most importantly, let's begin with the very simple act, remembering that we can bring chesed to the people around us. It makes a difference. Shabbat Shalom.